Toronto. VK on the beat. Check. I'm in Toronto where you wanna get a city love. I'm from Toronto where you wanna get a city love. I'm in Toronto like we wanna get a city love. My city love me back for my city love.
Welcome to episode 1148 of Toronto Mic'd. Proudly brought to you by Great Lakes Brewery. Order online for free local home delivery in the GTA. StickerU.com. Create custom stickers, labels, tattoos, and decals. Palma Pasta. Fresh, homemade Italian pasta and entrees. The Yes, We Are Open podcast, a Moneris podcast production. The Advantaged Investor podcast from Raymond James, Canada. RecycleMyElectronics.ca. Committing to our planet's future means properly recycling our electronics of the past. Ridley Funeral Home. Pillars of the community since 1921. Canna Cabana. The lowest prices on cannabis. Guaranteed. And Sammy Cone Real Estate. Ask Sammy any real estate questions at sammy.cone@properlyhomes.ca. Joining me today, making his return to Toronto Mic'd, is the Toronto Star's Ed Keenan.
Hey!
Welcome back, Ed.
Hey, I'm glad to be here. It's been a few minutes.
It's been... Ed,
3 years.
It's longer than that. I got the dates.
Yeah, no, it's been. I used to feel like I was in this exclusive club because what have I been 3 times, right?
You're 3 times. This is your 4th visit.
And as we did that third time, I was like, I'm in some exclusive club, and then and Mark Weisblot just like means that there's no actual club.
Are you subscribed to his newsletter?
I am, absolutely.
Did you notice there hasn't been one since September?
Yeah, I know he wound it up with St. Joseph's Media there, the Toronto Life Empire, and now he's got something else cooking.
There's always something cooking in the Weisblot kitchen, but he's still here once a month. You're right, but he's actually not the guy with the most appearances on Toronto Mic'd. Cam Gordon, who was recently musked. That's now a word. He got musked like last week. Was that last week or this? Yes, last week. It's all a blur to me. Friday, I guess. Anyway, he got musked, but Cam Gordon has the most appearances. But Ed, when you were a 3-timer, you were like in the lead for a short period of time. And I thought you were going to be a regular, but you literally up and moved out of the country. And this pre-pandemic, as you might remember.
Yes, no,
you
absolutely.
Couldn't zoom in. You couldn't zoom
it.
in. Oh yeah, we're going to get into the details, but I did not allow guests to zoom in. There was no remotes. Like, you had to be in this basement. And when you're living in DC, and we're going to get to what happened, but you're not making the trek to the studio.
No, it's like a 500-mile drive, as they say down there. It takes an entire day. You can do it door to door in about 8 or 9 hours, but
it's a long way to go. Like for lasagna, that's a long trek, right? Okay, let's do the specifics and then we'll find out where you're at now. But before we even talk about your previous visits, Ed, I asked you that question before I pressed record. I think of you as Ed Keenan. You look like an Ed to me, but I know whenever you publish something in the Star, it's Edward Keenan.
Well, I mean, on my driver's license and my birth certificate, it says Edward.
Yeah, mine says Michael.
But people call me Ed.
You can call me Ed.
So, it's just here's the honest truth is that when I was starting to work as a professional journalist, after I got out of university and after when I finally was starting to work my way back into the business after being outside of it for a long time, you have to kind of choose a byline. Like you're publishing something, you got to put your name on it, and Edward seemed like a more serious grown-up name than Ed. And so I started using that, thinking, that's my professional brand. And my friends will call me Ed, but in the, the big business world, everybody will know me as Edward. And then everybody still just calls me Ed anyway. Even if I wanted to switch to Edward, it's, as you say, I look like an Ed, I guess.
You look like an Ed.
Because I go out, when I introduce myself as Edward, people will immediately start calling me Ed. Like, immediately. I'll say, hi, my name's Edward. And they say, hey, Ed, how you doing? And so I think people whose name is Michael, who want to go by Michael, get the same thing. They're called Mike all the time. Davids get called Dave.
Okay,
Roberts get called Bob. So
yeah, I will say that Michael Landsberg, I asked him if I could call him Mike, and he like shot it down like it was an insult. And you know what Michael Landsberg said to me? Mike is the guy who fixes my car.
Fixes his car or invites him on the podcast, one way or the other. I mean, and that's at a certain point. I had this image in my head of Ed as an office manager. I probably should have. I missed an opportunity to continue going by Eddie all of my life.
Yeah, Fast Eddie.
When I was in elementary school, everybody called me Eddie.
Yeah.
And then in high school, teachers and stuff started automatically calling me Ed, and I didn't correct them again because it felt like, oh, I'm growing up. I'm not Eddie anymore. But then you reach a certain point where being an Eddie or something like that, Jimmy, starts to seem cool again. Like, you know, as when you meet a really successful, put together adult who has a name like Johnny or Jimmy or Eddie,
right? Then
you think, well, they must have a lot going on because they still go by their sports nickname or their childhood nickname.
That's a good point.
Anyhow.
My oldest son is named James, and I always, like, from the moment his mom and I decided that this was going to be a James, I always thought of it as Jimmy. Like, Jimmy, I thought that's the coolest name. Imagine being called Jimmy. And I tried to make it stick, and I call him Jimbo and Jimmy, and no, he goes by James. Like, there's, it's not Jimmy.
I used to work with a guy named Jim, and then one day I just called him James, as like I was being formal. And he said, that's not my name. And I said, but it probably was your name at one point, right? And he pulled out his driver's license, showed me. He said, Jim is short for Jimmy. And what it said on his driver's license was Jimmy, Jimmy.
Okay. Shout out to Jimmy James, a great Beastie Boys track from Check Your Head. And Ed, you checked your head as you did all the way back. You ready for this? 7 years ago. You made your debut in this very basement 7 years ago, November 2015. That was episode 143. So do you realize you were episode 143, and now you're 1,147?
Oh, we missed an opportunity there. I could have come earlier in the week and had the round number.
You blew it, man. Okay, so what I wrote at the time, if people want to go back to episode 143, because that's like the A to Z. They're going to be like, why aren't you doing... Memory lane. They're going to be like, where was the talk about iWeekly and the grid? And I'll be like, no, man, that's episode 143. So Mike chats with Toronto Star columnist Edward Keenan, I called you Edward there, about his years writing for iWeekly, the grid, and the Toronto Star. But we also make time to talk Rob Ford, the Stockyards, his News Talk 1010 radio show, at Norm, that was the big thing at the time, at Norm on Twitter, and more. So that was your debut. You came back the next year, July 2016. This was episode 183 that you came by, and we literally just shot the breeze on what's making waves in Toronto that summer, and that was a great visit. But then, here, I got a song to accompany this. Stand by, Ed Keenan. A little music.
That's Kevin Quain. My friend.
Absolutely. And you actually introduced me to this jam. And since your visit in November 2017, 5 years ago, I have basically been like putting this on many a playlist and kicking it out regularly. You introduced me to this great jam.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I just didn't know it. And I know I should maybe local talent like Kevin, but Mr. Valentine's dead. A little bit of this.
Mr. Valentine's dead, and he's drinking Manhattans, singing a coal miner's tune. In his daddy's tuxedo and Fred Astaire shoes, he's the best looking corpse in the room.
When I actually came back to Toronto recently, which I guess we'll get to.
Yes, we will, sir. In about 2 hours, we'll be there.
One of the things I looked up is whether Kevin Quain had any gigs coming up, because if people out there are listening, he used to do the Cameron House once a week, and that's where I got to know him. I worked down the street, and we'd get off and go see him. But his live shows are just a lot of fun. It's a mood to be in a bar and have him just sitting there at the piano pounding it out.
Sing his praises, Ed. He deserves it. And again, thank you for introducing me to this jam. That was episode 287. where we talked about, I guess there was a post-media Torstar newspaper closure, and then alt weeklies were, we'll talk about that again, because Now Magazine has gone the way of the grid there, but we played and discussed your 10 favorite songs of all day, and this is one of them, and we even kicked out a Christmas jam, and we both agree it's the one Christmas song that we could listen to in July and enjoy. People can guess what that is, but go to episode 287 to hear Ed Keenan discussing his 10 favorite songs of all time. You kicked out the jams.
I did. That was a lot of fun.
And then I never saw you again until yeah. So that was 5 years ago. It was November, 5 years ago, and then it stopped. So why don't you take us? So now we need to catch up on the last 5 years. Where did you go, Ed Keenan? Why did you leave us FOTMs?
Well, I went to Washington, D.C. to be the American correspondent for the Toronto Star. So my family and I moved down there, I guess in 2019, and had a bit of an adventure.
Well, I want to hear the details, but just remind us, who are you replacing?
Well, Daniel Dale was the American correspondent, the Washington bureau chief before me. Of course, he, back when my first couple visits here, many of your listeners would have already known Daniel Dale because he was the Star's one of the Star's City Hall reporters for a while, the City Hall bureau chief, or acting City Hall bureau chief. He famously almost got beat up by Rob Ford when he was reporting on him. He was taking pictures of Rob Ford's backyard because Rob Ford wanted to buy the public park that adjoined it.
Yep.
And so he went down there and then became sort of internationally famous because the way he approached the job is that he was just fact-checking Donald Trump. That was something he had also done with Rob Ford.
Well, I was going to say, it really felt like the Rob Ford coverage was the ideal training ground for somebody who was going to cover a Donald Trump presidency.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, he attracted a big enough following doing that he was a regular guest on CNN fact-checking Donald Trump. And then he eventually got hired by CNN to be their accuracy expert, basically the fact-checker of not just Trump, but everything.
Right.
And that left a vacancy there. And so when the job came open, I applied for it internally at the Star.
Wow. Okay, so what were you doing for the Star before you got this new gig?
I was a city
Washington.
columnist. I was a city columnist. And that's right. I have been basically I was a city columnist for the Grid. My title there was senior editor, but I basically wrote about the city. And I had a weekly column and I would do sort of features. Before that, I was a editor at iWeekly, but I wrote a regular city politics column, city life column. And so, my whole career up to that point had been essentially as a city columnist and city feature writer, just writing about Toronto, which is something I love doing. And as we'll get to,
we love you doing it. That's
now.
why, where did you go? Okay, so just to let people know nuts and bolts here is that Torstar owned the Grid. Okay, so iWeekly becomes the Grid. So you're already in the family. When they shutter the Grid, rip, shout out to Ridley Funeral Home, missing the Grid. You are like so good. They're like, hey, Ed, you already work for us, like writing for this paper we just shuttered, but like we have this other paper called the Toronto Star. You could write there, and you're like, yes, please.
Yeah, it doesn't have the same street cred, but it's
slightly higher readership. Maybe.
Yeah, I mean that's essentially what happened. I worked for the iWeekly, which was also owned by Torstar,
right.
Starting in 2003,
and that was Torstar to compete with Now Magazine.
This month we probably just came up. It was actually, no, it was last month. October 2002, I began as an intern, an unpaid intern at iWeekly.
Okay.
In June 2003, I was hired there as a full-time staffer.
Wow.
And so then I worked there as a writer,
but you're a young man, so
editor,
like this is the only job you've ever had.
Well, I'm not that young.
Okay.
I had spent...
I'll check that driver's license.
Yeah. But I mean, I was 29... when I started at iWeekly.
Okay.
So you can do the math there.
I just did it, man. You're got a couple years on me, but not too many. Okay. So, though, so Torstar, when they launched iWeekly, which when I was a teenager going downtown, like I always picked up the two. There was Now Magazine and there was iWeekly, right? So like I didn't have a good sense of, iWeekly is a relatively new phenomenon. It was just there, okay? So, but that's Torstar's like reaction to Now Magazine. I had Michael Hollett on this program within the last year, so we kind of dove into the origin story of Now. But Torstar launches iWeekly to compete sort of with Now Magazine, and then at some point that rebranding, of course, iWeekly. I don't actually understand why, but anyways, iWeekly becomes the Grid. They shutter the Grid. You start working for the Toronto Star.
Yeah, basically. I mean, when they shuttered the Grid, the managing editor of the Star, basically almost everybody at the Grid except I think two of us, one of the business people, ad sales people or marketing people, and me. Basically, we're given severance packages, and instead the managing editor of the Star at the time, Jane Davenport, came and said, don't your phone's going to start ringing off the hook, and don't take any calls or don't accept any jobs until you've had a conversation with us. So
nice to hear that.
You're not so it was like three weeks or so, and I did have a lot of other interesting conversations, but. For a guy who was a city columnist already and was interested in continuing to just do that, and for whom that's essentially just a dream job, the Toronto Star is a place you'd want to be to do that. Like being a city columnist at a big city newspaper is like Jimmy Breslin, Mike Royko. Like this is the job you want, and so there was no better place for me than the Star.
Now that name, Jane Davenport. Is that a fake name like Johnny Dovercourt?
As far as I know, it's her actual name, but I didn't.
Because that's an ideal.
Her birth certificate or anything.
Because if I were in a position like that in the Toronto paper, the Toronto's most popular newspaper, Jane Davenport is a pretty cool name. Like that's the name. Like because Johnny Dovercourt, who's been on the show a couple of times and does a great job covering like music venues in the city, etc. Like that's obviously a fake name because that's a Toronto name, Johnny Dovercourt. Jane Davenport is like the equivalent.
It is,
Just shouting out that name.
It's actually like the John Doe, Jane Doe equivalent because the Jane and then, of course, Davenport.
Because it's like she couldn't go
Davenport and Dovercourt,
yes.
Is an intersection you can go to. So
and often confused with each other, too. The alternative name might have been Jane St. Clair, but the Bare Naked Ladies already
got
took
there
it.
first,
Shout out to the
exactly.
Okay, remind me, do you have a personal relationship with any or all of the ladies, the Bare Naked Ladies?
Not a personal relationship. When I was
a random question.
I was a teenager in Scarborough, and they were at the time at Woburn Collegiate. And once I went to I think it was like a Christian youth weekend in Sharon, Ontario, like retreat. My parents had signed me up for or something. But and Ed Robertson was there and had his guitar and said, I have this band, the Bare Naked Ladies. And then he sang like You Can Be My Yoko Ono and McDonald's Girl and stuff around the campfire. So when I got back, there was no internet, but I started talking about the Bare Naked Ladies and went downtown and found that they had that little yellow cassette.
Absolutely.
And bought it. And so I have met and then Tyler used to live down the street from us, and I think one of my daughters went to a birthday party at his house once. But I have no friendships with them. I've had encounters with a couple of them.
See, every Torontonian worth their salt has a good story about encountering a Bare Naked Lady or two. That's pretty good. I will say that in addition to Ed Keenan's Toronto Mic'd appearances, if you want a golden, wonderful episode of Toronto Mic'd, that Tyler Stewart episode is next level. Like he came and he brought it.
Excellent.
As you do every single time, even though it took 5 years to get you back here. But we're now building
I had to
up
have something to bring, Mike. I left it all on the floor the last couple times, and so I needed to accumulate some new stuff to talk about.
Quick fun fact, of course, is that McDonald's Girl does not appear on the yellow tape. In fact, they've never released it as a recording. So the version you would hear on CFNY, because they played it all the time, would be like a recorded live version. And nowadays, if even Tyler himself doesn't have a decent version of that song. Like you have this crusty old live version that was recorded off the
but
radio.
you have it on like a cassette tape somewhere that you recorded on the radio,
Right.
where like the announcer is in at the beginning, and then you got a few minutes of the ads from the time at the end. But
So anyway, if anybody has a clean recording of McDonald's Girl, hook me
you've
up.
probably talked about this before, but you've seen the guy who actually, the reason they didn't record McDonald's Girls because it wasn't an original song.
Right.
And the guy who originally recorded it, it was just like a novelty one-off, and then it became a hit kind of later.
Yes.
And he tried to figure out why, and he was like, "Oh man, it was the Bare Naked Ladies recorded this."
See, I got to find that guy and get him on the show. That's the story we need to find.
So, I if I had known it was going to come up, I would have looked up some of the more specific details, so I had it. But it was like I read. He wrote a blog post or a piece about how this song he wrote years ago resurfaced and became a hit in the internet age because it had been a radio
Dean
hit here
Friedman.
in Toronto. Dean Friedman, there you go.
Is the man. So, Dean, if you're listening, I've had a Dean on my show this week, Dean McDermott. But if Dean Friedman's listening, we need to talk. We need to talk. Okay. So you apply for this opening because Daniel Dale is taking his talents to South Beach. No, to Atlanta, to CNN. So Daniel Dale leaves the Star, goes to CNN. You apply for this gig and you get it.
Yeah, and it's interesting because at the time, a lot of people, when I announced it, were like, "That sounds like a demotion."
Really?
Like, why would you? But I mean, some people treated it that way. A lot of people thought it sounded like a big promotion. Like certainly a lot of my aunts and uncles thought, "Well, now you've reached the big time."
It sounds like, to me, it sounds like a promotion.
You're actually going to, and so I mean, I think it depends on how you look at it and whatnot. It's certainly a higher profile job, maybe a higher status job in some ways, or certainly a bigger. It's not necessarily a bigger platform because this city columnist at the Toronto Star gets a lot of play in the Toronto Star,
right?
But you certainly are hobnobbing with important people from around the world on a more regular basis and all of that. The thing is, though, the reason I applied for it, and this is what I think might be worth not just skipping over, is that I always loved being a city columnist, and I love this city, but I had lived here my entire life. I didn't go away to go to school or anything. I never lived outside of Toronto. And I had never, I in my career, I've occasionally written pieces about sports, and I've done some, federal politics and provincial politics, and I've written features that are about like, music and arts and whatnot. But Toronto had been the subject of my writing for so long. And it's one of those things, like I said at the time in a column that I wrote, where like, you listen to your favorite song for years and years on end, and you still love the song, but the drums don't kick the way they used to. The way the hook used to like surprise you every time is just becoming a little routine, right? And so I just kind of wanted a change of pace. And boy, the United States in the age of Donald Trump looked like the most exciting story in the world to cover. And as you mentioned, when I got down there, Daniel Dale had moved on to CNN, but Jackson Prosco from Global, who you'll remember finally re-asked the question that got Rob Ford to admit that he had smoked crack, was down there.
Right.
Katie Simpson arrived around the same time I did. Adrian Morrow from the Globe and Mail. Is all the old gang from City Hall.
Well, I still think of Katie Simpson running down the hallway with her microphone. Mr. Mayor Ford,
when he talked about the buffet that was the Ford marital bed.
Yes.
The look on Katie Simpson's face is inextricably tied to that moment in my head because we were all watching it on CP24.
Feel like a fever dream now, like when when I have these guys on like Matt Elliott or whatever, and we go back and we talk. It feels like a fever dream. Like I know we all lived it, and I remember rinse on my I remember being engaged as much as I could be in any municipal politics. It was happening daily, crazy. Like that happened, man, and you were there.
It did happen, and I was there. And I mean, there are lots of other crazy stories, but Toronto City Hall has not been like that before, and it might not be like that again. There are very. I mean, weirdly, you started by saying the Rob Ford was a good training for Donald Trump, and in a lot of ways, it's true because there are a lot of parallels. And one of the strongest parallels, though, which doesn't necessarily go to their politics or anything, is just that they always take it further. They'll never do what the conventional thing is to do, and they'll always just make it crazier. Like, how can I ramp up the crazy? Like, it was take our daughter to work day, take our kids to work day last week, and my daughter came with me down to City Hall, where I have a desk in the City Hall bureau at the Star. So we went to the council chamber, and with the staff who were there, it just kind of came up like, you remember at the height of the crack scandal, and I think it may have been after the more than enough to eat at home moment, the entire world media, the New York Times and the BBC and the Daily Show and stuff were all at City Hall. So the normally already crowded press gallery at the time was just overflowing with all this international press, and there was this full house of people there to watch the meeting. And Doug Ford, reader, he would go on to other things. Listener, his story was not over yet. Doug Ford start picking up a fight, what threatened to be a physical confrontation with some of the union guys who were in the front row, just screaming at them and kind of gesturing to them to provoke them. So they stand up and start screaming back at him. So, of course, Rob Ford stands up and starts barreling over as if to save his brother, and knocked over Pam McConnell, who was a much older city councilor, a veteran from the 80s of city council.
Wow.
And it was just so I was explaining this to my daughter, and it's just that came back into my head when you said, or when we were talking about how
fever dream.
Every day, the story just got more and more nuts. And in a way, Donald Trump's presidency was like that too. He just kept taking it to another level right up until even after he had been voted out. And of course, I was there when his supporters tried to take over the Capitol building. So,
man, I'm so many. I mean, now before we get to the highlights from your DC years, and oh my God, you were there for that too. There's a book or two in you, I'm sure it'll come when you're older. But are you working on a book right now? You writing a book right now?
Oh, I don't know.
Because you did the Rob Ford coverage.
I got all
you did
kinds of stuff here and there, but yeah.
All right, you got your beacon. Okay, so the family. Okay, so you're not a single dude with no kids. You got a family. There's kids.
No, I have 3 kids.
Right,
and
3 kids. Right,
yeah.
Was it difficult to sell them on, or I guess you only have to sell your wife and you make the kids. You're going with us. You're okay. You have no choice. But to move the family to another country, that's a big deal.
It is. And the kids actually. So here's some background. I had never lived outside the city, and I had always thought I never wanted to make my permanent home anywhere else. But I did think it would have benefited me to see some other part of the world, just be somewhere else. And I thought it would still benefit me in adulthood. But my wife, Rebecca, she lived in Halifax, and she moved from Toronto to Halifax and then to the Bronx when she was in middle school age, and then back to Toronto. And I think that experience had always she had always thought of it as a good experience. Her dad was a university professor, and so he taught at Fordham University in the Bronx for years and years. His family only lived there with him for a shorter period of time, and then he commuted. Her parents are still married, but he then for decades drove back to Toronto every second or third weekend and came back for the summer. But so she had thought that was a really good experience, and so when we were talking about what happened is that when the Star sent out the announcement to say, we're looking for expressions of interest in this position, I came home and said to Rebecca, "Is it crazy to think about this?" And she said it might be like an adventure, right?
Yeah, it might be crazy not to think about this.
Yeah,
that's an exact quote.
So we started thinking about it, and then I had conversations with the senior editors at the Star who were going to do the hiring, or some of them. Irene Gentle, who was the editor-in-chief at the time, I went into her office and said, and she had been my direct supervisor when I first came to the Star, so I had a good relationship with her. But I went in and said, is this the kind of thing you would consider a columnist for? Like, could I go down there and still be me? And she said, or would you even consider sending me, right? Like,
right.
And she said, she wasn't going to ultimately make the decision. There were like the people, like the editors who reported to her, but who are in charge of that section would ultimately be, making that decision. They were empowered to make that decision, but that she didn't think it was a crazy idea. So, my wife didn't think it was crazy, and the editor-in-chief didn't think it was crazy. So I applied and interviewed like everybody else. And I'm trying to remember where I started. So once I got the job, though, we didn't tell the kids that we had applied for it. We didn't want to. So it was a difficult conversation to have with them, especially, and I don't want to get, like, without their permission. I'm one of those people who does post pictures of my family on Facebook and stuff, and I talk about it with my kids, and they're older now. Like my eldest is 16, so they're at an age where they understand what's going on and all of that. But I don't want to get too much into their private thoughts and feelings on it. But I'll just say my son was going into grade 8 at the time, and for him, he and his friends had been talking about high school options. They've been talking about their, essentially their valedictory year of elementary school. He'd gone to a kindergarten to grade 8 school. Grade 8 was going to be their year to be the kings of the school.
Right.
They're already planning out which high schools they're going to go to. He's just at an age where he's starting to feel like he has some agency in his own life.
Right.
And so sitting down and telling him, we've already decided we're moving you to a different country where you don't know anybody and we don't know anybody.
Right.
It was hard for him. And it was actually hard. Like, my kids reacted differently once we were there. One of my kids really thrived there and made a lot of friends and was disappointed to move back. One of my kids had a really hard time with it. The other one was kind of like, a little bit of each.
Right.
But I mean, what we hoped then and what we hope now is that experience of having gone and started over a little bit in a new place, now that they're back home and back in touch with the things they loved here and the people they loved here, that provides them not just a perspective. Like, DC is not a radically foreign culture from Toronto in a lot of ways, right?
Sure.
It's like they have the same fast food joints and the
Right.
they watch
language.
the same TV shows more or less, right?
Right.
But it is a different place in the world, and also just the experience of starting to try and build a social circle or adjust to a new school or explore new neighborhoods and new things. I mean, I hope that winds up being a really positive experience in their life. I hope so. Otherwise, they fuck us up, our mom and dad.
Right.
They don't mean to, but they do. That's the foundational origin story of every great superhero and poet and
Absolutely.
And everyone else. So maybe it'll be fuel for that. Who knows?
Okay, so before we get you back here, and welcome back, you're like the prodigal son. You've returned, Ed Keenan. Good to see you. I can't believe you're here. 5 years, been too long. But can you, I don't even know how you want to approach this, but I just want some highlights from the DC years. Like, there's so many big highlights, but what say you are the highlights of covering, Washington politics? For the Toronto Star?
The thing is that, so we just were talking about the Rob Ford years at City Hall, and one day, Marcus G turned to me and said, I said something like, this is just a amazing story, right? I think it was actually the all-night deputations, another of those famous. But anyway, I said this is an amazing story. And
Right.
Marcus G of the Globe turned to me and said, horrible for the city, great for us. And that's the problem of being a journalist or
Right.
whatever, is that a lot of your highlights are actually lowlights in everybody else's view, right?
Absolutely.
And not just because, like, bad news sells and all of that, but just as a storyteller, the
Yeah.
most fascinating and interesting things that you get, the stories you tell, have a lot of conflict and a lot of tragedy often, and sometimes comedy resulting from that. So, while I was in the United States, obviously there was a pandemic here as well as there. It was an interesting perspective to have on the U.S., but I also covered the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests in the streets, some near riots in the streets. Like, from beginning to end, I covered that those street protests, not just in D.C. but elsewhere. I covered 2 impeachment trials. That is now half of the impeachment trials conducted in American history I have been an eyewitness to.
Okay, so can I, just because I want to get the history right, is it Nixon and Clinton? Are they the first 2?
Nixon was never actually
because he resigned before.
So it was
right.
Andrew Johnson.
Andrew Johnson, okay.
Back in
you were just a kid back then.
Post,
okay.
1800s, post-Civil War era. And then Bill Clinton.
Right, okay.
Nixon would have been impeached.
Right.
But when he realized that he didn't have the votes to fend it off, he resigned.
He pieced out.
Exactly. So I covered, Donald Trump's 2 impeachments and impeachment trials.
Wow.
Then I covered the Uvalde shooting, the Buffalo shooting, massive gun rights rallies. I was in Minneapolis when the Derek Chauvin verdict of the trial for George Floyd's killing was announced. I was in Philadelphia on the day of the Four Seasons Total Landscaping press conference, but I actually decided not to go to it. I drove back to D.C. because I was expecting the official results to come that day, and they did. And I wanted to be in D.C. to see the reaction to that. But I had spent days in Philadelphia where that was like the real locus of the debate about whether they should stop the count or count every vote. And there were conflicting Trump protests and democracy protests in front of the convention center where the counting was happening, which is why Rudy Giuliani flew in to have his press conference.
Well, okay, I want to talk about that press conference. Hold on.
And
then, sorry, go ahead.
And then I covered the election.
I'm so excited you're here. Okay.
And then I covered the insurrection as well, right?
Okay, we're going to get to that insurrection.
Yeah.
So what I found interesting about Trump, this is what's interesting about Donald J. Trump. Okay, but like in the states where he was like down, it was like, keep counting. And then in the states when he was up, it was like, stop the count. Like, it's just so wild. I think there's a quote from him where he says something to the effect of like, if we win, it's all because of me, and if we lose, it's not my fault. Like, this is sort of the...
That was just like like the other night about the midterm elections.
But that's Donald Trump in a nutshell,
actually said that, right?
Yes.
Like, I think if they win, I should get a lot of credit.
I should get all the credit.
I should get none of the blame.
It's not my fault.
And it's not just that, like, as a psychologist, you can look at a lot of people and say, this guy's a narcissist. This is the way he thinks about the world. It's that he'll just say that part out loud. Like, he believes
and he's not
it.
self-aware,
He's not joking,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
He's like... That's what he...
So for us reasonable people, like when we hear that, it's sort of like tough to process. Like, is it a parody? Is it a satire? Like, is he in on the joke and leaning in? And then when you realize like he's being sincere and he's and he means what he says and he believes it, it's quite shocking and disturbing. I'm not a psychologist either.
Yeah, no.
I'll leave it to the psychologist.
It is. I mean, his niece, who is a psychologist,
right?
Diagnoses him. Yeah,
yes.
Diagnoses him as she says, as just a malignant narcissist, right? And so, I mean, there is something like just pathological there.
Yeah.
It's weird because you say like he's sincere and all of that, and he honestly believes or convinces himself of a lot of this stuff. But he's also like, his main mode of operation is kind of cynical, like openly cynical, like he talks about, getting the better of people in deals, and he's one of these guys who thinks like openly like that you have to be the macho alpha male, and we'll talk about it in those terms. And so like he has a real view of the world in which like everybody's cheating and I'm going to be the king of the cheaters, right?
Right.
But then he also, it's like you can see, and I haven't spent personal time with him. Not only am I a psychologist, but I haven't had reams of access to Trump. I have been in the same room with him. I have heard him deliver speeches in person and whatnot, but I have not spent one-on-one time with him, so I don't know the contents of his heart. But I do know from watching him that you can watch him in public talking himself into something that's absurd. Yeah. And then of days of talking about the same subject, accept it as an article of faith.
I knew we were in trouble. I mean, you were right there in the heart of the storm. But when he made that public declaration before the election in 2020, I guess the election was in 2019, right? So that
the election was in 2020.
Okay, yes, November 2020. Right, of course. Okay, so the inauguration's in 2021. Got it. So here, I'm all set now. But he, when he said out loud that like if we lose this election, it was rigged. Like he just makes this declaration to his large legion of followers that if the count comes back and we have less votes than Joe Biden, they cheated and the game was rigged. And to this day, there are candidates winning who believe the 2020 election was stolen.
Yeah, and he was laying the groundwork for that from the spring of that year, talking about how he thought there was a plot afoot to steal the election from him and all of that. And he was telling people openly that you'll know it was rigged if I lose, right? That's going to be the proof. And there is a big strain of the Republican Party's base, and a big strain of the mainstream Republican Party now across the U.S., who basically has adopted that like Democrats winning is evidence of fraud, period. Like, on its own, because it's just impossible to conceive that they would win on the merits, right?
Wow.
Like, and there's a bit of this phenomenon in some of those believers. Like, I think there's a lot of people who are genuinely maliciously manipulating this, right? I think there is a lot of regular people who have a like cognitive
impairments.
Yeah, maybe. But it's like so in Toronto, my dad once said to me, and I didn't realize until later that he was paraphrasing like another American famous quote, right? But he once said to me sort of like, Mel Lastman won 80% of the vote. And he said, I voted for Tucker Gomberg. Everyone I know voted for Tucker Gomberg. My priest voted for Tucker Gomberg. Like everyone I've met in my life voted for Tucker Gomberg, and yet somehow Mel Lastman won the vote. I don't understand how this happens. And I think, especially in the United States right now, depending on where you live, but most places you live, like if you live in Bethesda, Maryland, if you live in New York City, you almost never meet anyone who's voted for Donald Trump, but they must be out there, right?
Sure.
And if you live in Trump country,
right.
Like all the media you consume, Fox News and whatnot, and Newsmax, and are all and talk
that
radio,
AM radio,
AM talk radio in the U.S.
Is
like telling you one thing, and your Facebook, TikTok, Twitter feeds, whatever social media you
Alex
are on,
Jones,
the followers the people you follow are all on the same page, and you go to a Trump rally and you see like 20,000 people out there, and then you think, and that's what Donald Trump would say is like, it's impossible that we lost Georgia. Look at the size of my rallies.
Right.
And look at the pathetic little car rallies that Joe Biden was having. And so they can't imagine why there would be a difference between, I mean, by that standard, of course, like the University of Michigan football team would have the most votes.
Right.
But I mean, so there's a genuine sense in their mind where like,
is that where you can't see the forest for the trees?
And
like,
you'll talk to people like who actually have that. Yeah. But like they're like they see the trees and they assume the forest must be all made up of that kind of trees that are right in their immediate vicinity, right?
Right. Well, it's like,
but they honestly don't. Like it's like it's a lot of that. Like there's an availability bias where what they can see.
Right.
That must be true. Right. And so it's inconceivable to them that the opposite could be true. The opposite must be fraud. Right. And so like, anyhow, that people who should know better and including, like anybody who wants to pay attention to it should see through that. But yeah, there's a big strain of the Republican Party now who basically are saying we need to fix the fraud problem, and in their mind, the fraud problem is that Democrats win. That's the problem. Like those dirty Democrats are actually showing up and marking a ballot for someone other than a Republican, and that's not fair.
And that's why that statement by Donald Trump is so on point, which is basically like, if we win, it's all because of me. If we lose, it's not my fault. Like just type that out, and that's amazing. Okay, but this whole Yeah, go ahead.
No.
So I mean,
I need to take a quick break just for 1 minute. I know we don't do this, but I.
Oh yeah,
I have
that's
a very
okay,
small
man. I can
bladder,
edit.
so-
You get a small bladder. Ed's got a small bladder. That's okay. I'll thank some sponsors. You go
Yeah,
there.
yeah,
Don't
let's
worry.
do
Don't
that.
worry.
Okay.
You take your time. In fact, I'll put back on your music while I do this here, so we can't hear the stream here. He's got a very small bladder, ladies and gentlemen. That's okay. I want to thank Great Lakes Beer. I would say that Ed's in the washroom now because of Great Lakes, but it's a morning recording and we have not consumed any. But delicious, fresh craft beer. We love Great Lakes here. We love Palma Pasta. I've already shouted them out, but TMLX 11 is going to be on December 3rd at noon. I hope Ed Keenan shows up. That would be amazing. Everyone's invited. You're going to eat free pasta. I'm going to go talk to GLB, make sure we got fresh craft beer. I'll have hopefully stickers from stickeru.com. I have a Toronto Mike sticker for Ed. Thank you, stickeru.com. I don't know if Ed's smoking the reefer, but if anyone out there wants cannabis, whether you smoke it or drink it or eat it, Canna Cabana will not be undersold on cannabis or cannabis accessories. Shout out to Canna Cabana, over 140 locations across this country. If anyone has a real estate question, any real estate question at all, Ed Keenan just moved back to Toronto. We're going to find out about where he set up shop. But Sammy.Cohn at properlyhomes.ca. Cohn is Kohn. Sammy, by the way, we talked about Bare Naked Ladies earlier, but Sammy Cohn is the drummer for The Watchmen.
Ah.
I love The Watchmen.
Speaking of 90s CFNY go-tos.
I love The Watchmen. I had Danny Graves perform live at TMLXX, which took place at Great Lakes Brewery on September 1st, and it was amazing. So shout out to The Watchmen. Shout out to Sammy at Sammy.Cohn at properlyhomes.ca. Let me give you something, Ed. Oh. There you go. I'm giving you something.
Oh,
so
look
Ed
at this.
Keenan has a wireless speaker.
speaker.
Box, and that's courtesy of Moneris. Moneris wants you to have that wireless speaker. Do you know why Moneris is giving you...
stop the music tonight. I'm not sure the syllables work in quite...
Oh, it's probably like this. You don't have to listen to Al tonight because Al Grego hosts Yes, We Are Open. That's a Moneris podcast production. Al Grego has been telling the stories of small businesses in this country and their perseverance in the face of overwhelming adversity. You can go to yesweareopenpodcast.com. Subscribe right now. Al Grego just won an award. He's going to come over later this month, and we're going to talk about it. He's an award-winning podcaster. I'm not an award-winning podcaster, but Al Grego is. Shout out to Al Grego. And one day, Chris Cooksey will be an award-winning podcaster because he hosts the Advantaged Investor podcast from Raymond James, Canada. The Advantaged Investor provides valuable perspective for Canadian investors who want to remain knowledgeable, informed, and focused on long-term success. Here, industry specialists share resourceful insights on economic events, longevity and retirement planning, growing your financial legacy, and more in each discussion-based episode. Again, it's hosted by Chris Cooksey. Welcome back. And yeah, you can, if you need to take shifts, just let me know, man. I can roll with it. It's all good. But now that you're back, okay, I want to just share this, and everybody knows the story, but I think it's such a wonderful story that the Four Seasons Landscaping, that you did not attend this conference, and it was... Yeah. So the anniversary was just a couple of days ago, and on my Twitter feed, Twitter's a whole other tire fire we can talk about in a minute, but on my Twitter feed, I saw a photo, and they're like, oh, it's the anniversary of the Four Seasons Landscaping press conference. So the fact is...
It's Four Seasons total landscape.
Okay. Yeah. But so when Rudy Giuliani's speaking at this thing, and it was during this whole, the stop the count stuff that was going on with the 2020 election, but they legit thought they were booking a Four Seasons,
all right? So here's
what's the story there?
Here's what happened. So I was in Philadelphia there for days, right? Because, there were a few states outstanding where the vote was so close that they couldn't declare a winner. And if you'll remember, Donald Trump's remaining path to victory was if he wins Georgia and Nevada and Pennsylvania,
right?
I
remember.
It can come down. But Pennsylvania was the important one because if Biden won Pennsylvania, none of the rest of it mattered, right? The Electoral College victory was secured.
Right.
And so they start, he starts tweeting stop the count, he in all caps. And he was for a few days or a part of a day there anyway, his mantra was stop the count. They're cheating. I have already won. And now look at how they're
and the
adding
delay is mail-in
votes.
ballots, right?
These are mail-in ballots.
But can I ask,
and
why in this
absentee
country we
ballots.
don't have that? Is it because we count our mail-in ballots before election day? Like, as
Yeah,
they
and
come
in some
right?
states they do that, like Florida,
Right.
which the Republicans have started routinely winning. Florida, there's a long tradition of They reformed all their laws. Jeb Bush reformed all their laws after the hanging Chad fiasco of 2000. You'll remember.
I'll never forget.
And because of that, they now have like huge absentee ballot. Donald Trump voted as an absentee mail-in ballot guy in Florida, and they count all those votes in advance, and so they are one of the fastest and most accurately
Which, by the way,
reporting
to me
people.
just makes sense. Like, I don't understand why you don't start counting. Like, what is it?
I mean, I understand keeping those results under lock and key.
Oh, sure, yeah,
but
like,
tabulate the ballots in advance,
like Oscar votes. You know, you got.
Yeah, well, also, I mean, there's an issue where you don't want. In Canada, we used to have a law, and it just became too difficult to administer, so they actually changed the timing of when our polls are open. But like, you don't want voters who are leaving their house
in California
to already have a sense of what the vote is, right? Like, if you said, oh, based on the early vote, the Democrats have won, maybe lots of Democrats don't show up on election day, maybe other people who get discouraged or whatever. You actually reshape the whole thing by giving partial results in advance, right? So I understand why, but I mean, most American states now, I think all, I'm trying to just think if there's an exception. I mean, in Nevada, they're fighting it and they insist on hand counts in some counties, or they're trying to, but there's machine counting in almost every part of the United States now. So the early votes can be scanned into those machines. You just have to keep the results secret, right?
Of course.
And any person operating the scanner would only know their like precinct level results anyway, because they're being aggregated in some, central office, right?
Right.
But yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. But if you count those votes in advance, then it's harder to say, look, we already counted all the votes on election night, and now they're changing the totals. They're changing the totals, of course, because they were counting more.
the mail-in, which we're favoring Democrats for the obvious reason that for some reason they politicized COVID-19. And this is a whole separate conversation, but somebody was tweeting like, why have masks been politicized? Because masks seem to have been politicized. Like in this country, the conservatives are anti. I mean, for whatever reason. And I said, well, the moment they politicized, this was my Twitter response. The moment they politicized the climate emergency, the climate crisis, like everything gets politicized now. Like if that can get politicized, anything can get politicized.
Yeah,
and COVID-19 got politicized.
It did, and.
So Democratic voters were going to be more likely to mail in.
Not only that, Donald Trump was openly discouraging people from mail voting in advance because he was saying that was a mechanism of fraud. And a lot of Republicans were saying, don't do that. In Utah and in Florida, like, we count on the mail vote. We have all these senior citizens who don't live in Florida, but who vote here, and we need their mail votes.
Yeah, because they do count, which is the fact.
But so Donald Trump had basically done a vote in person on election day is the only legitimate vote campaign, and so a lot of his supporters didn't vote by mail. And
also, they were less afraid, apparently, of getting COVID by going to the polls.
Yeah, because they thought
it's
it was all a
safer
big
to just mail in. You don't have to go.
So. They had come out of quarantine a lot earlier than everybody else, forced themselves out of quarantine. It's a side note.
Yeah.
when
Love the side notes.
You remember when vaccines first came out and they were hard to get.
Of course.
And they were easier to get in the United States
you
than
guys
here,
got them first. Yeah.
but they were still, the first couple weeks, really hard to get.
Right.
And so what my wife and I did was, because Washington, D.C. and the surrounding area, you couldn't get an appointment for weeks. So we actually Googled what in Maryland, what jurisdiction was the highest highest Trump voting county.
Right.
And then we actually searched their map, and every drugstore there had appointments available. So we drove 3 hours to rural Maryland to get our first shots.
That's using your brain, Keenan. That's smart. I will say, fellow FOTM Mike Wilner, I remember during that period of time where you can get it in the States, but we didn't have it yet in Canada. He actually flew to Pennsylvania or something to get the shot and come back. And I remember thinking, I guess if you want it badly enough, you could do that.
Yeah. But I mean, the politicization, it shaped up similarly in a lot of different parts of the world. So who knows how much you can attribute to Trump. But it does seem like early you remember here in Toronto,
Mm-hmm.
really early in the pandemic, and some people were starting to say masks could help. And I remember in DC made my first mask out of paper towel and elastic bands because I saw a thing telling you how to make a jerry-rig a surgical mask, right?
Right.
Put 3 layers, and if you can, put a layer of cloth in it. But there was a left-wing, like, progressive warrior movement for a couple weeks of, like, do not wear masks.
I remember this.
Because you don't know how to wear it properly, and you're wasting a mask that should be worn by a medical professional. And plus, they probably don't help. They may actually hurt because you're going to handle the mask and get the virus
thank
on
you for bringing this up, because my wife was making masks. She's in her in her spare time for fun. She's a sewist. I think that's the term. And she was sewing these masks. And I remember I tweeted about the fact that she had an Etsy store and she was selling masks for like $4 each or whatever. And they were really good masks, like Raptors, and they were cool. I still have a bunch. But I got tweets from people like, don't wear masks. They're more harm than good. Like there was like an anti-mask, an education
and it was like a
issue.
real left-wing based at first. Like it's sort of like sanctimonious minding everybody else's business crowd was really like mask shaming. Like how dare you wear a mask? And I think what happened is that, medical evidence, like public health authorities who initially didn't want people using N95s that were in short supply for their own trip to the grocery store. They wanted like a nurse to be able to have that for her shift, right? So that message got caught up in the they don't actually work message. Right. But I think once the sort of public health authorities and medical evidence started to come forward and they were saying, no, these actually will help. And in fact, like surgical masks or their equivalent, if it's worn by both people, like my mask protects you, your mask protects me. So it switched. But what happened too, though, I think, is that then Donald Trump, for vanity's sake, and he basically openly admitted that he just didn't like the way it looked. And he thought it made him look weak. He thought it made him look whatever. Refused to wear one most of the time.
Right.
And, but he did get up and say, we are implementing mandates even, right?
Right, mandates.
But, I think it should be everybody's choice. Like, I choose not to wear one. We recommend you wear one.
Right.
But I choose not to because I'm a real man, basically, right? Like I'm not
and
some
he got COVID
cock.
Pretty good, right? Like he was pretty sick.
He did. He was hospitalized very severely.
Just think about what since your last visit 5 years ago, think of what's happened. Like the whole pandemic happened. That happened. I remember Donald Trump was on oxygen. I can't remember what the details were.
Yeah. I was outside the hospital, Walter Reed Hospital, where he was, and there was a vigil of Trump supporters there.
Yeah.
Some of whom thought the deep state had finally got him there, because they still thought COVID was a fraud.
Fiction,
but others who were just praying for him and convinced that their prayer was gonna do the job and whatnot.
In the end, those are the guys who would show up at the insurrection, right? Like we didn't even talk about January 6th yet, but this is like a coup. This happened. We saw this live on television.
Yeah. Well, I saw a lot of it live in person.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I mean, and it was certainly the time I was in the United States was a fascinating time. And a lot going on. You talked about the Rob Ford years being just this kind of avalanche. And when you're the only American correspondent for the Toronto Star, that avalanche, is nationwide, right? And it's constantly happening. And so, there's a whole saying of drinking from the fire hose.
Right.
But when I was down there, you actually just had to choose which fire hose you wanted to put your face in front of because it was there's just hundreds of them gushing.
Okay, so you said you were the only American correspondent for the Toronto Star, but here you are living in Toronto. So, what happened that you came home? Was that an Ed Keenan decision? Was that a Toronto Star decision? Give me the real talk.
Well, it was an Ed Keenan decision, but it was a conversation that was started by some of the editors at the Star, and so the honest truth of it is that I had planned to stay another couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
But my wife, Rebecca, in particular, even I, we're also starting to think like, we were starting to really feel like being away from Toronto hurt. Partly because there was stuff we missed. But also, like my parents are both alive and relatively healthy for being in their mid-70s, and Rebecca's parents too. But something will happen, like COVID happened, and we basically couldn't come home hardly at all for like 2 years, right?
Right.
Which that's different. We're only an 8-hour drive away, so our plan had been to come home or have somebody come and visit us, like essentially once a month, right? Like, and come home for like a few weeks in the summer and at Christmas, and basically we almost nobody came to visit us, and we didn't get to visit anybody here. But also, when you're thinking about COVID and you're being trapped on the other side of the border, and you think, what if my parents get really sick from this? What if they're hospitalized with this? And I can't be there, right? Even if I wanted to come home, I would have to quarantine for 2 weeks before I could even go and see them.
Right.
And, so like one of our parents had a hip replacement last year, and that's not life-threatening, but it is the kind of thing where it hurts to not be able to go over to their house and make them dinner and just check if they're okay and bring the kids by, right? So you start to think there's a limited number of years when you're going to have this relationship, when your kids are going to develop this relationship. And so things like that, there were a few things like that were starting to make us think, as much as I wanted to cover another American election campaign, basically, like when there wasn't COVID, hopefully, and it could be a more conventional campaign, there were also personal reasons that we wanted to come home. And so one of my editors at the Star called to say, we're really happy with the work you're doing down there, and we're happy for you to continue doing that work if that's what you want to do for as long as you want to do it. But we also really miss your voice as a Toronto City columnist. And they have other people at the Star who also write on city issues and whatnot, but they felt like there was a particular kind of thing that I did that a newspaper like the Star needs. And if I wanted to come back and do that, they were willing to have that conversation about how to make that easier. And if not, that's fine. But if not, they also might have to go out and try and see if they could recruit somebody to fill that role because it was a necessary role. And so that having started that conversation with Rebecca, and then we didn't want to have the conversation with the kids because if we chose one way or another, we didn't want it to, break their hearts or whatever. But the more we thought about it, the more it seemed like the timing was right. Like it was professionally a really exciting job to have. And for us personally, it was also like a real adventure and a really interesting thing. I mean, Washington, D.C. is actually just a great city to live in, and maybe more so than I expected before I moved there. But it also felt like, to me, it was the right time to come home. So the Star was happy to pave the way for that. They were excited about it, but they didn't sort of force me into it. They presented it to me as like, hey, here's just something that came up. Like, we're looking for somebody who does what you used to do.
They're looking for an
and
Ed
your
Keenan.
name came up. Like, hey, what about Ed? Well, what's his plan? How long is he thinking about being there? Because maybe we don't need to go hire somebody if he's going to come back.
But I have a question, Ed. Yeah. Did they need to, who's the current American correspondent for the Toronto Star?
There isn't one.
See, there's tough questions on Toronto Mike.
No, that's okay. And if I had the authoritative answers, I would give them to you. There's not one right now. The most recently I was told is that they haven't made a final decision to not replace me ever there, but they're not currently replacing me there. And I think the Star used to have a lot of foreign bureaus in Hong Kong and in
London,
South Asia,
London, Ontario,
Johannesburg, South Africa, in Israel. in like they used to have a lot of
Right.
foreign bureaus, and the Washington bureau has been the last one. All the rest had been shuttered, basically as cost-cutting measures over the years, where you're trying to decide when the very continued thriving and existence of the paper is the subject of the strategic discussion. It's like, do we cut costs in investigations, or do we cut costs in our South African bureau, where we can pick up wire services? And
Right.
and so slowly they've made the decisions to close those other ones. They haven't made a decision to permanently shutter the Washington bureau, as far as I understand, yet.
Well,
but there's a
yeah.
I am not involved in this conversation, but my understanding is that there's a strategic conversation about how to approach foreign coverage going on in the Star right now, and that the results of that conversation will decide how they want to tackle that. Right now, also Alan Woods, who lives in Montreal, who just actually had been living in Russia for years, is providing sort of American analysis, reporting mostly by phone. And I think if he needs to travel to cover a story in person, they will send him to do that. But I think, like, for the last few weeks, at least as far as I can see, Alan Woods is doing some coverage of the United States.
Well, we should just address the elephant in the room, which is that there's this looming deadline at Torstar, because you have the owners, these what does Weisblock call them? No longer BFFs, he calls them. So, but there's literally a deadline where to sort this out. Like, these two people can't coexist, and they're kind of, to the victor will go the newspaper. Which is, by the way, I'm going to ask you about what's up with 1 Yonge Street, because for years my wife worked at 1 Yonge Street, but not at the Star, but at another business in there. And I guess so. There's two things going here, but to do the 1 Yonge Street thing quickly. Do you still have an office? Like, is 1 Yonge Street done as a Toronto Star office?
Let me just check my calendar here.
Is it?
No, actually, so
Yeah.
as of Monday, we are speaking on Thursday.
Right, the 10th of November.
The 10th, yeah. So as of
2022.
the upcoming Monday, the entire Star office is moving to the Well at King and Spadina.
End of an era.
It's actually Spadina in front. Sorry. So, so at the corner of Spadina in front, where the Well is, that used to be where the Globe and Mail was. Before that, it was the Toronto Telegram. There's a long newspaper history on that site.
Sure.
But yes, it is absolutely the end of the era, because the Toronto Star building at 1 Yonge Street is no longer going to be the Toronto Star building. The company built it there.
Yeah.
So the Star's office was originally.
Yeah.
Well, I actually don't remember the street names. It was originally like in a storefront when it was founded as a strike sheet. But for generations, it was at the corner of Bay and King, which and they sold that site to the developers of First Canadian Place, the Bank of Montreal Tower that is there, has been there since you and I have been growing up in the city, right? The big white marble center of the banking and Bay Street legal community. So that used to be, for generations of people, that was the Star building. And then, for 50 years now, it's been 1 Yonge Street, which was built by the Star to house their offices. The Star sold that building to a property management company.
Man, I've seen those blueprints.
Years
that
ago.
development's going to be wild.
I mean, but they
Like
sold it a long time ago.
Sure.
The building, and then they had a long-term lease on whatever terms to stay there as tenants.
And this is the last week.
But the writing was always, they were always going to eventually move out of there, because, I mean, it was built 50 years ago. And you wouldn't build it needs updating, right? It needs a lot of updating. And also, it was built at a time when the Star was a much bigger organization than it is now.
Sure.
Both because partly because the newspaper business isn't massively profitable the way it was, but also partly because you used to have armies of copy boys and steno girls and a live switchboard and a printing press in your building, and you no longer need that stuff, right? And after the pandemic, everybody learned, many of us don't even need to be in the office on a regular basis. We can in the journalism, lots of people were already not in the office on a regular basis because, as Michael Cook, the former editor of the Star, once said to me, there's no stories in here, boy. Get out there and chase it down.
Right.
Like, you're not going to find the story sitting at your desk. And you got to get out in the city. But even more so than ever before, like, you don't need to be in the office. But it is the end of an era.
End of
right?
an era, but also
Like,
how much is this this legal battle or whatever, this mediation, the two guys who now own Torstar who no longer want to work together, like, this must be the chatter, and there's no cafeteria anymore to have the talks. But like a lot of decisions, I'm sure, are waiting on that to get sorted out.
They are now. So Paul and Jordan, who bought the Star together, who are no longer friends, and
no longer BFFs.
You know what I love? Here's just an aside.
Yeah,
I love the topics where we can talk, and I just feel like this is the most casual thing, and I can just say whatever I want.
And that reminds me, you are the only guest I can think of who required an edit to a Toronto Mike episode.
Now it can be told that the reason was because I revealed information to you that was under a publication ban, and I had just completely forgotten that publication ban had
just
been
to
in
let
place.
the FOTMs know, because I love this moment, is like we finish up, like, in all mine, I don't edit anything, as people know. It's part of the charm of this podcast, unedited. But at the end, you look at me like, oh, he's like, oh, I said something that could get me in big trouble. And then I said, what
and
did
potentially
you say?
get you in big trouble too.
Well, yeah, I guess so. And then I said, well, I can edit that for you, Mr. Keenan, because I don't want us to get in big trouble. And we took it out. But I just remember that. So don't say anything that's going to require an edit, because I don't want to edit this podcast.
And I don't plan to. But what I was going to say, though, is that, like, here's my commitment, is that I try to tell the truth, right? And I'm trying not to spin. And so
I know, I'm watching you sweat over there.
There
it's
are
fun.
things that I don't know, and it would get me in trouble to speculate on. And then there are things that are just matters of, like, you know. So here's what I will say that is, like, as honest as I can be and as open as I can be without
you're
getting
honest
into
Ed.
like
Okay,
office
you're honest
gossip,
Ed.
right? Like,
Go
this
ahead.
is more like the what the truth as we understand it, being employees of the Star, is that Jordan Bitove and Paul Rivette got together to buy the Star in the early days of their partnership. John Hondrich, who was the representative of the families who had previously owned it and had this commitment to, his driving, as it turned out, dying wish was to keep the paper alive and give it the best possible chance to succeed in the future and still be the Star, still be dedicated to the Atkinson principles that his family had made and then lost a fortune in the service of, right?
Sure.
So, they got it and started making what looked to a lot of us like encouraging investments and stuff. There was some hiring done. There was some whatever. And so I think recently they no longer agree about the direction of the paper or the direction of the business and how it should proceed. They have filed court documents that and Jordan Bitove has Paul Rivette filed some court documents. Jordan Bitove has responded with some public statements. They disagree about whether certain kinds of cost cutting need to be done to save the business and other things. And as a result, they seem to no longer trust each other. And I think that's all public. And so, as inside the company a lot, there's been a sense that, like, mom and dad, and maybe our recently adoptive mom and dad,
Sure.
Are getting a divorce.
Right.
And what they're deciding they went to court, but in court what they decided was to go to arbitration and to try and break up the company and sort its assets between them through a private arbitration process, mediation process. They're in that process now. And so, yes, to come around, I'm not privy to the discussions of, like, the strategic direction of the paper anyway.
Right.
But I think a lot of those discussions are on hold, or at least a lot of those decisions are on hold right now, because it's unclear who among the two manage the owners who are activists. They're proprietors, right?
Right.
They consider themselves proprietors, not like passive investors. They are, like, managing the company, and it's right now it's unclear who gets to authorize new spending or budget cuts or whatever. So when they first took over together, they started planning our move to the well, right? And they announced that fairly early, and that move to Front and Spadina out of One-Young has been in the works for a year, and now we're still moving there. But other decisions, possibly including how to tackle foreign coverage, but lots of other decisions are probably gonna they're gonna be we have to wait and see who gets to decide, right?
Which makes sense to me. Like you'd pause those decisions until you have the dust settles on who owns this thing.
And there are some of those kinds of decisions, like we recently had a couple business reporters go on and take other jobs, one at Wire Services and whatnot, Bloomberg in the States, and so they have posted the jobs and hired one new reporter to replace one of those people. They've posted another one. There's some hiring going on. Like some of the strategy is just continuing to unfold, right? The paper hasn't ground to a halt to wait for this dispute.
Right.
But I think the big strategic decisions about how things are going to unfold over the next few years are in flux right now, would be my understanding. Because it's not clear who ultimately is going to own this paper and who ultimately is going to be making those decisions. The Torstar, which Jordan and Paul bought, owns a lot of other assets, right? It owns other daily newspapers in Ontario. It owns a whole chain of community newspapers. These guys started together a gambling operation, a legal gambling operation that's also under the same corporate umbrella. They own some online properties, Vertical Scope. I believe they still own, although they sold. I haven't kept up on all the corporate stuff, but it's a company that owns other things besides the Toronto Star. And basically what they're deciding now is that they're breaking up as business partners, and they're splitting up the company, and who gets what, right? And so the question ultimately is going to be which of them winds up being in charge of the Toronto Star. And it seems like at the core of their dispute is that they have fundamental disagreements about the best way to make the business a roaring success, right? It's good that both of them still believe that it can be a success and want it to be, from what I can tell. So we will have to wait and see, just like everybody else. But yes, potentially decisions like, should we keep open a forum bureau and or open new forum bureaus, or should we attack foreign coverage a different way, might be the kind of decision that's going to be waiting on ultimately who's going to authorize that decision, right? And what their strategy is.
You mentioned John Honderich. Did you read his memoir?
I have read his memoir, yeah, and I attended the launch of it the other day. So
okay, not much chatter in that memoir about iWeekly or the Grid, like
almost none. And that doesn't really surprise me because I think, I would have thought,
but
maybe
you must be a little
mention.
Disappointed when you read it and realized that there was wasn't worthy of a chapter or two. I don't know.
Here's the weird thing is that when I opened the book when I first got it, as many people do, many people who when you read a memoir by somebody
right, you want to know if you're in it.
You flip to the index,
right?
And I did look up my own name, and I'm not mentioned in it anywhere, as far as I can tell, unless I skipped a page.
I did this with Ben Murgie's book. Ben Murgie put out a book, and the first thing I did was, because we've worked pretty closely together the last few years, and it's called I Thought He Was Dead, and I realized I went to the index, and I was not in this book. He just
but
erased
I
me.
don't think I even checked if iWeekly or the Grid were in the index. Like it's like you and Mark Weisblatt tweeted something, and then I was like, oh yeah, I guess that is a bit odd that it didn't at least.
Well,
get mentioned.
we're all over this.
But here's the thing.
Go ahead.
In Michael Hollett's mind.
Yeah.
There was a sense that like iWeekly was like this corporate assassination project. And I think legitimately, I wasn't around at the start of this. So, his story he's told to you. And I think the Star maybe made a play to buy.
So you heard that
now.
episode?
You just told me about it earlier
Okay.
today.
Okay.
I didn't actually listen to it, but
All right.
I've heard Michael
Just checking.
Hollett's version of this story a few different times. I worked for his main competitor for years.
Right.
The Star made a play to buy now, and when that play was rejected, and they had already launched the What's On section of the Star, I think, too, as a let's be entertainment. Also came out on Thursdays.
Yep.
But so iWeekly was launched as a competitor to get into that market, and I think so. I'm not privy to how big a play the Star thought it was at the time and all of that. But by the time I got there, there was still a lot of chatter in alternative Toronto, encouraged by Now, as there's this well-funded corporate entity that is fake alternative, trying to drive us out of business. And they're just following the marching orders of John Honrich, right? Their Star overlords are sending them their marching orders, and they're going out and executing them. Whereas by the time I got there, what it felt like to us who were on the staff was more Heart of Darkness, where Kurtz is out there just running his own entire thing, the Apocalypse Now. At some point they had started this thing, and as far as we could tell, nobody in the Toronto Star was still knew it existed. Nobody in Torstar knew it existed, except that occasionally they would slash our budget by another 25% over what it had been before. But and we kind of liked it that way. We would have wanted bigger budgets, but it was also just if any senior executives at the Star and at Torstar knew iWeekly was still being published, they might just shut it down. But in the meantime,
that's funny.
We just kept going.
So you liked it, below the radar.
That was though my impression of things, and so it never occurred to me that that it would have been a big part of the book, because as far as I could tell, it was an afterthought almost entirely for all of its existence. And then at a certain point, when it changed into the Grid, we were reporting up to John Cruikshank, who was the publisher of the Star, and there, I think there was corporate investment in trying to see if it could turn it into something that would be more sustainable and profitable, and have more of a cultural impact, and be more of a potentially a skunk works for the Star.
I was going to say, you're describing Star Touch.
I almost brought you a Star Touch screen.
How's Star Touch doing anyway?
It shuttered a long time ago.
I know.
There was that time.
It never worked on my phone, by the way, or my laptop. I never owned a device that would actually.
It was specifically designed not to work on phones and not to work on laptops. It was a tablet-only platform, and we named it what you would name a sketchy massage parlor.
Star Touch. Yeah, if it's neon lights, I could see that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Like a rub and tug. But I mean, I'll say a lot of people at the Star were really skeptical from the beginning that the strategy of going tablet based was wise. But I will say that the company threw both feet into earnestly trying to make that work, because they believed it would.
Oh, they sure did. I mean, they put their money behind it.
They put a lot of money behind it. It hired a ton of people who worked really hard on it, and it's a sad chapter in the history.
Shout out to Ridley Funeral Home.
Yeah.
Okay. I know you're scoring.
But we were.
Go ahead.
What I'm trying to remember, because I feel like we digressed a long way, and we had originally there was a question I was
giving you space, so I know.
Yeah.
I'm giving you space to meander and figure it all out. This is sort of part-time therapy, but because we're talking alt weeklies, even though John Honrich didn't know about iWeekly, they didn't tell him about the Grid. But you just wrote about the grind. Okay, so since you were last in Toronto, iWeekly. Belly up, okay? iWeekly's no more. I mean, I don't know if it's definitively flatlined, but as far as I'm concerned,
Now Magazine.
What did I call it? iWeekly. Yes. Well,
I did.
Now Magazine. I mean.
Yeah, and
I'll fix that in post.
I don't think that's actually a surprise, right? So,
right. Is that because the massage parlors there's not enough massage parlors like Star Touch advertising in the back of those things?
It's a million things, right? But no, well, and actually, I think making those things illegal was another small tick of the pendulum or whatever, right?
Right.
But basically, at a certain point, classified advertising in general, not just the prostitution ads or whatever, but classified advertising was the cash cow of the newspaper business, and that includes free weeklies, right? Advertising was by definition the only way the free weeklies made any money, right? And so the internet made classified advertising completely redundant, like just a giant waste of money for anybody who would engage in it, right? First, like places like Craigslist and then other places meant that there are just better, legitimately better ways to do this advertising, right? And so, you know, that's like strike one, right? And then strike two is that like retail advertising, like including like big national advertisers, are taking their money and putting it into other things.
Google and Facebook.
Yeah, especially Google and Facebook. But I mean, for alt weeklies, I feel like there was a genuine mission issue that comes up too, where you start to wonder, what purpose do we serve for our readers? And as I wrote recently, I think there were purposes that were served that haven't been adequately replaced elsewhere. But while I was working at iWeekly, there's like a situation where it's like, it used to be, if you're a young person in Toronto, let's say you're in your 20s, or even if you're an older person, but especially if you're the type of person who goes out multiple nights a week and is looking for something to do. You and your friends meet at a Future Bakery or something, and you open the alt weeklies and you see who's playing at the Horseshoe, who's playing at Lee's Palace, what theater stuff is going on, what's playing at the Bluer Cinema. Like, it's all in there.
Yes.
And that's the only way to find out without going in person to every location to see, right? It's the easiest way, and you can just pick them up all over the place. You can flip through it on the subway, right? So those listings, both the advertisements that like the bars bought, but also the listings that we had whole armies of staff compiling, were the way to find out what's going on in the city.
Absolutely.
And it was around the time when like message boards, but also Facebook arose and whatnot, where like the online groups and stuff started replacing that listings functionality for people, right? That like the people who were really into live music would be finding out about shows on their phone, not in their alt weekly, right? And, you know, movie listings like the showtimes, they started to be able to see them easily look them up on their phone directly through the cinema companies and whatnot, right? And so bit by bit, these things where alt weeklies filled a hole in the marketplace and did something that nobody else was doing, were absorbed by other things, and often like more easily available things, right? Or more targeted things, right? And so your core reason for existing as a valuable service to your readers starts to get really slowly watered down. So I think the relaunch of the grid, of iWeekly as the grid, was an attempt to try and see if there was a way to reinvent that free weekly model that tackled things from a different angle. It wasn't a massive listings-based thing. It didn't have classified advertising from the beginning. It was trying to like fulfill a different purpose. And I think, you know, you and I may have talked about this in one of my earlier visits, but I think there was a bit of cultural success to the grid, a bit of zeitgeist capturing for some people who remember it very fondly.
And that's me, by the way.
But it was not an economic success, right?
Right.
And so ultimately, like, it got put down before it could waste away. But I think now had a stronger, from its founding, sense of its own mission, both in sort of as like an alternative leftist politics voice, but also like a really independent voice in the Toronto arts community, and was dedicated to that mission all along. And Alice Klein pushed it as far as she could, and then tried to sell it to somebody who might carry it into the future. But I think for probably 5 years or more, it's been I think the one time you and I were on here talking about alt weeklies, and I had talked about some of this same stuff, and the then editor of Now tweeted at me to say, like, that's all nonsense, right? That alt weeklies aren't redundant and all of that. But in Toronto, in Vancouver, in New York City, in Los Angeles, like across North America, alt weeklies have basically either hollowed out or shut down.
Yeah.
And I think there's something sad about that because, I think there was a role that we played. From
nostalgically, it's very sad because you and I are of an age where we have such memories, the 90s basically. But we have such great memories of these alt weeklies. But the internet did kill the alt weekly, and it's just part of the evolution.
And a lot of the stuff that they used to do is still done, right? It's like whenever I get nostalgic about things like my favorite old bar closing down or whatever, right? It's like I realize that the things I used to get from that, a new generation of people is getting somewhere else. Like they're still doing the stuff, right?
Right.
They're just not doing it in the places that I did it, and so that's sad to me as an old guy. But
it's like I miss the old video. I miss the video store that I used to go to. Like I miss talking to the guy, and he'd say, "Hey, man, you'd like this new director. This thing's called Reservoir Dogs. I think you'd dig it." And then I rented it, and I'm like, it blows my mind. I'm like, whoa, like I miss that. But I'm
even
no fool.
The event of going out there to the video store and wandering around for an hour and a half trying to figure out if there was something you're in the mood to see.
Or it's like going to the record shops to hear new music. Like now we just do that, in our bedrooms here. Okay, but just to put a bow on this alt weeklies talk, because I mentioned the grind. What can you just tell me, is there even going to be another issue of the grind? Like what is the grind trying to, fill that void now that now, pun intended, now that Now magazine is no more?
I don't have any window into the future of the grind because I haven't even spoken or communicated with the people running it, but I think they're I donated some money to them because I wish them really well. It's basically like a bunch of like journalists.
TMU journalists maybe?
Took their own money to pay for that first issue. And a lot of them already write for like socialist or leftist online publications, and they're reprinting stuff that's already been published there. So that's like why the grind has not got its own website with that stuff, because almost all of the stuff is already online, right? But they think there's a street level way to reach the working class with that needed independent political perspective through, the alt weekly model of a newsprint paper that you can pick up and read on the subway or at your coffee shop and whatnot, right? And I wish them really well with it. I when I wrote about it, I said, like, reading it doesn't scratch that itch for me. It isn't trying to be, their dad's alt weekly, which was me, and which was mine, which is fine because it's not for me, right? It's for them. So we'll see. I imagine there'll be at least one more issue. They put it out and they said it was an alt weekly style thing, but I think the first issue was labeled like for 2 months. Like they're planning to have another one at the end of the year or something, and then we'll see.
We'll see.
But I think their funding model is going to have to be that people donate money to it or pay for it. It may be free to pick up on the street, but people are going to have to pay for it another way. Which is, I mentioned at the time too, that's what Dave Bedini's doing with the West End Phoenix, right? Is that they sell subscriptions and they hold fundraisers, and that's how they pay to keep that spirit alive there. So I'm a subscriber to the West End Phoenix. I was a donor to the grind. I want a million alternatives to flourish, even when they're the alternative to me at the Toronto Star.
Well, you love newspapers. And,
I do.
We don't want newspapers to go the way of the dodo bird.
No.
Okay, so a couple quick hits here, because I know it's almost time for your next bathroom break. I've been very quick hits. This came through in the live stream, so we're live at live.torontomike.com, and Steve Leggett wants to know, have you made a trip to Jumbo Burgers since you came back to Toronto?
I have. I've made a couple trips to Jumbo Burger, which is under new ownership, but seems to have... like what I was concerned with is like if the picture of Ty Domi would convey with the business, and it did. It's still there.
Good.
The orange seating is still there, but also the recipes. And in particular, I love Jumbo Burgers. Like actually cooked on that flame broiled like fire grill.
Yep.
It's a particular kind of Toronto diner burger that is among my favorites. I don't have a favorite kind of burger. I like a smash burger sometimes. I like but it's like there's a certain flavor there that I wanted. And also, but I love their onion rings so much, and I was so desperately afraid that they were going to ruin the onion rings.
Right.
And at least in my experience so far, they didn't.
So did you return to the Junction neighborhood? Like, you don't have to give me specifics.
No, it's
but what neighborhood do you live in now?
It's a good question because I was such an obnoxiously loud and proud Junction resident before, and even when we
and Siobhan Morris, as I remember,
moved to the United States, we used to refer to our house as the Junction Embassy, but we live in Bloor West Village now, which is
that's an upgrade, more expensive there,
adjacent to the Junction.
Yeah,
but
Stockyards. I know my real estate. Shout out to Sammy Cohn. But you moving from the Stockyards to Bloor West Village. That's a you're rising on up. I feel like I'm going to sing the theme song to the Jeffersons.
It's a more expensive neighborhood, that's for sure. I still love where we live is at like Runnymede between Annette and Bloor Street.
I know it so well that I just want to say I worked at the McDonald's at Runnymede and Bloor for 18 months as a teenager.
So the thing is that our kids can still go to the same schools that they went to before or were going to go to before.
Right.
And our friends who lived in the Junction and my kids' friends who lived in the Junction were still a short walk
very close.
to go to their house and visit them and stuff. And the Dundas Street Strip, which we loved, is still a short walk away, right? You don't have to take a bus or drive. It's like 10 minutes up the road. And so, but we're closer now to Bloor Street, and the access to the subway is just life-changing and awesome.
That's the thing about this city. Like,
my daughter goes to high school downtown, and so she gets to ride the subway every morning, and I think that changes a lot of your experience. I've lived in places where I had to take like half-hour bus rides or more than one bus to get to a subway line on a lot of my routes. And that makes TTC commuting a real unpleasant. Right. Whereas living near the subway line makes it much more.
But do you have data on the subway now? I bike everywhere now. So like I'm literally like if I need to get anywhere. In fact, I actually later today I'm going to be at the
You do not have data on the subway, and it is like one of the most frustrating things. I mean, among the aspects of living in Washington, D.C. is that, you can use your phone on the subway. It's no problem, right?
I just remember hating that part of
the Toronto subway system has the technology installed in it to provide cellular signal underground, but Rogers and Bell refuse to provide the service.
Wow.
You can read about that in the Star if you Google it. The details I don't have in the tip of my mind, but essentially like the TTC put out got all the infrastructure installed, and then there's a company that was supposed to manage it.
Yeah, I remember this.
And Rogers and Bell are refusing to play ball with that company.
Well, that's fucked up, Ed.
And so it's like, I think it's one of the services like Freedom Mobile or something like that. Like you can get into it in the station only, but not in the tunnels. And it's just like,
well, my memories are like, that part on Kiel when you go above ground.
Yeah,
there's certain parts. It's like, that's when all your texts
you
came
come
in.
out on the Bloor Viaduct and all of a sudden 1,000 notifications chime. It's like,
or Old Mill. There's that nice part of Old Mill when you come above ground. And it's like, all my texts are flying in and out. It's we got to fix that. Man, you've been awesome. Honestly, you got to come back. You can't wait another 5 years to come back. My last question for you. Any chance that we hear Ed Keenan back on News Talk 1010, formerly known as CFRB, well, still known as CFRB, but any chance we hear Keenan back on CFRB?
I'm not sure. I was at News Talk 1010, then after that I was at Global News Radio AM 640.
Which they rebranded back to Talk 640 or something like that.
And so, since I've been back, I've done a few things with Global, just, panels and whatnot, but I don't have immediate plans to get back on the radio regularly, but I'm certainly open to it. So program directors, news directors, if you're out there listening,
and they are,
my ears are open. So,
you're taking
you know what? As we've gotten back, it's been a couple months where I'm just really focused on getting my feet back under me, learning the city, doing my Star stuff, and then of course the next thing on my agenda was come back to Toronto Mike and reestablish myself as a friend of the show.
4th time, buddy. But that was a 5-year gap, so we can't go another 5 years. But dude,
Yeah, no,
honestly, when I saw you in the driveway and I gave you a big hug, I'm like, there's my buddy Ed. It was like, man, I miss this guy.
Yeah,
So
no,
welcome
it
back,
does
buddy.
feel good to be back.
Welcome
And
back.
I mean, in 5 years, there are new, different sponsors and sponsor gifts by the look of it. So
Yeah,
I got
you
a
know.
speaker here.
You got a speaker, you're gonna get lasagna, you got beer, you got it all, man. You got a sticker. You're gonna be taken care of, my friend. Thanks for coming over. This was awesome. Now we get to take that photo again. Because 5 years ago I was doing the photo. I have to make sure some people are pre-photo before I realized I should probably do that. And that brings us to the end of our 1148th show. You can follow me on Twitter. Yes, I'm still there. I'm just kind of seeing what happens. That's a bit of a tire fire lately. Shout out to Elon Musk, but I'm still there checking it out. And you're there too, Ed. You are the Keenan Wire.
That's right. I am still there. I'm still at the Keenan Wire.
And people should subscribe to the Toronto Star and keep that awesome newspaper going and keep Ed employed there. That's important.
Yeah, and get access to all of my stuff. Like, you don't have to sort of like navigate the paywall and all of that.
Our friends at Great Lakes Brewery are at Great Lakes Beer. Palma Pasta's at Palma Pasta. Don't leave without your lasagna, Ed. Sticker U is at Sticker U. Moneris is at Moneris. Raymond James Canada are at Raymond James CDN. Recycle My Electronics are at EPRA_Canada. Ridley Funeral Home are at Ridley FH. Canna Cabana are at Canna Cabana _. And Sammy Cohn is at Sammy Cohn. That's KOHN. See you all tomorrow, and my special guest is Barney Bentall.
And I'll play this guitar just the best that I can. Well, maybe I'm not, and maybe I am. Who gives a damn, because everything is coming up rosy and green. Yeah, the wind is cold, but the smell of snow warms me today. And your smile is fine, and it's just like mine, and it won't go away. Everything is rosy and gray. Well, I've kissed you in France and I've kissed you in Spain, and I've kissed you in places I better not name. And I've seen the sun go down on Shakra.